And now it's time for us to discuss more of these headlines in simple keywords with Adam joining us via Zoom. Good morning, Adam.
Good morning, Lena.
Happy Thursday.
Happy Thursday, Friday Eve.
Right. Friday Eve indeed.
I'm coining that term.
I feel like a lot of people want to claim it, but I agree with the sentiment. The weekend is near.
Yeah, it is.
All right, let's jump into some of these major headlines for all of our listeners out there. Let's start with our economy section. This is our first keyword of the day.
Big step.
As expected, the Bank of Korea took another big step rate hike of 0.5 percentage point in a bid to fight inflation, prevent a possible capital flight, as we repeatedly mentioned that this was a likely possibility. What's the latest?
Yeah, so we've been giving hints that the Bank of Korea will be taking this 0.5 percentage point rate hike for the second time since July, and it certainly has. It's also the fifth consecutive monetary policy tightening since April as well, because, of course, inflation has been rising recently. Wednesday's decision sent the nation's benchmark rate back to 3% for the first time since October 2012. And the 3% rate is believed to be a level that can influence an economic slowdown, since it is higher than a 2.75% neutral rate, at which monetary policy is neither stimulating nor restricting economic growth. So that's kind of where the boundaries lie. Nevertheless, the BOK's Monetary Policy Board still hinted at additional rate hikes, addressing that it sees continuous rate hikes as warranted. And the central bank noted that consumer prices remain high in the mid to upper 5% range, although growth slowed down. And it forecasts such inflation, will stay on course for a considerable amount of time due to the impact of the weak Korean won, which compounds inflationary pressure. Concerning inflation outlooks for this year and the next, the BOK said it will be generally consistent with the August forecast of 5.2% for this year and 3.7% next year. But the central bank warned of risks such as the weakening currency and production cuts by oil-producing companies, the cartels known as OPEC+. The BOK also expressed concerns over growth slowing down, saying GDP growth for this year will be generally consistent with the August forecast of 2.6%, but it projected that for next year it will be below the August forecast of 2.1%. So it seems that it's looking at a slowed economy for next year, meaning that economic data remains gloomy until then. Now, BOK Governor Lee Chang-yong said most monetary board members at the policy meeting yesterday see that the current upward rate hike cycle will likely end at around 3.5%. So that could mean another big step hike next month. But how sharp, he noted, it will be lifted should be determined after analyzing the US Fed's monetary policy and other relevant economic data. The BOK actually only has one more rate-setting meeting this year, which will be held next month. Analysts speculate that the BOK will carry out a third big step rate hike to reduce the Korea-US interest rate gap and prevent an outflow of foreign capital in search for safe haven assets.
We'll leave it there for now as we turn our attention to, some North Korean updates. This is our second keyword of the day.
Nuclear threats.
The ruling party leader Chung Jin-seok has called for scrapping military agreements with North Korea if the regime does in fact carry out its seventh nuclear test. There's also calls from the PPP for South Korea's nuclear armament, but the presidential office says no such talks are happening with the United States.
Right, so those deals that Chung mentioned were a 1991 Inter-Korean Declaration on Denuclearization and a military tension reduction deal. Nuclear bombs can fall over our heads at any time, Chung noted, and he said the 1991 declaration has been made a piece of waste paper by North Korea. Now, under the declaration, the two Koreas committed to remove any threats of a nuclear war by denuclearizing the Korean peninsula from the production to the manufacturing of such weaponry. And Chung noted that for the past 30 years, since the declaration, the North has stocked up on plutonium and uranium-based nuclear weapons, and now even possesses intercontinental ballistic missiles. He added that the North has become what he called a nuclear weapons department store. And he stressed that South Korea should not bind its own hands and feet under the denuclearization deal. Chung, however, rejected views that he is calling for a redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea, saying the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty should not be taken lightly. But there are some calls from within the ruling party for that to actually happen. The presidential office, though, said Yoon retains his stance that the NPT should stay in place. It added that no such talks on extended deterrence or possible tactical nuke deployment have been discussed with the US as of yet. It has been one of those campaign pledges. We mentioned this yesterday that President Yoon touted during his campaign that tactical nuclear weapon deployment to South Korea could be an option. He's kind of backtracked from that since taking office. And the presidential office basically says now there's no real change in that stance as of late.
All right, we'll leave it there for now as we move on to our third keyword of the day.
Local governments.
President Yoon has called on leaders of local and regional governments around the world to come together to fight global challenges like the pandemic and, of course, climate change. Can you run us through what he said?
Right, so Yoon was addressing the 7th United Cities and Local Governments World Congress in Daejeon. And now the UCLG is the largest organization of local and regional governments in the world and the only local government organization recognized by the United Nations. Some 1,700 people actually flew into Korea for the week-long event, which ends tomorrow. Drawing from his own administration's experience, Yoon said he was determined to back local governments because local competitiveness equals national competitiveness, in his words. He said one of his main ambitions was guaranteeing equal opportunities to everyone, regardless of where they live, whether in a big city or in the countryside. And he pledged full support to reinforce municipal governments' financial capacity to become global leaders. And the president said the pandemic and the climate crisis call for a solidarity of not only countries but of local governments. He added that sharing their experiences would help humanity overcome various challenges. Meanwhile, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was also in attendance. He underscored the importance of partnerships to advance international municipal movements. Also, as head of Korea's Hub for Science and Research, Daejeon Mayor Lee Jang-woo said his city will strive to search for ways to help the world with scientific achievements. Daejeon being home to one of the top science and engineering universities in Korea, KAIST. So that's a pledge made by the Daejeon mayor.
All right, with that, we move on to our fourth keyword of the day.
1-year waivers.
So Korean chip makers are getting a little bit of breathing room. They'll be given a 1-year grace period that would allow for their China-based chip plants to continue importing critical chip-making tools from the U.S. What's the latest?
Right. The U.S. Department of Commerce officially notified Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix of these 1-year waivers for licensing requirements announced by the Biden administration not so long ago. Washington released new regulations to require companies looking to supply chip makers in China with advanced manufacturing equipment to first obtain a license from the department. Now, the move is seen as a scheme to slow Beijing's technological and military advances in this intensifying rivalry between the two countries. The measure was expected to disrupt the production plans of both firms, which generate enormous amounts of profits by selling their memory chips in China. They were worried that the US may want them to eventually exit from China, which is their largest overseas market. The 1-year waivers have slightly relieved their concerns, slightly being the key word there. That's because it is only a 1-year waiver, so they would eventually have to apply to those rules after that waiver is finished. Watchers believe the regulations are also likely to hurt the US semiconductor industry as well. The US government was known to have considered the ban's impact on US tech companies such as Apple from possible production disruptions at Samsung and SK Chinese plants. Now, the two chip makers dominated the DRAM and NAND flash sectors globally. Analysts say it is hard for smaller makers such as US Micron Tech to make up for any shortage if Samsung and SK face problems with production of their own. So it all ties into this whole this supply disruption issue. If Samsung and SK, the world's top two producers of chips, get problems with production, then of course it brings about another global supply disruption, which Joe Biden has pledged to resolve. So it's a very tough situation that they're in at the moment.
That's right. That unintentional ripple effect would have hurt, I guess, U.S. companies too. So that 1 year waiver ought to make a little bit of breathing room. But as you've said, fundamentally, there are no changes there. So it's a grace period to actually make the adjustments that are necessary, right, for more smooth production going forward. But for now, a year waiver is in place for those companies. Let's move on to our final keyword of the day.
No nukes.
So U.S. President Joe Biden says he thinks Russian President Vladimir Putin won't use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but he says threatening to do so is also irresponsible.
That's right. The most recent remarks by him came in an interview with CNN host Jake Tapper. He noted that the threat of a nuclear weapon could lead to a horrible outcome, but he said he doesn't think Putin will use nukes on Ukraine. But he did blast his Russian counterpart for kind of playing with the idea. Biden had actually warned last week that the world risks what he called Armageddon in an unusually direct remark about the dangers from Putin's kind of thinly veiled threats to use nuclear arms. He didn't really explicitly say that he will use nukes, but he kind of hinted at the idea. The US president also said in Tuesday's interview that Putin had underestimated the fight back from Ukrainian forces. Biden said he believed Putin is a rational actor who's miscalculated significantly. And he added that he believes the Russian leader has committed war crimes as well in Ukraine. Biden told CNN he has no intention of meeting with Putin also at next month's G20 summit, but that he would be open to talking if Putin approached him there about releasing imprisoned U.S. basketball star Brittany Griner. He added that any meeting with Putin regarding Ukraine, as the G7 agreed to earlier Tuesday, would not happen without Ukrainian officials present. Putin has indirectly threatened to use nuclear weapons. In a televised speech in September, he announced a partial military mobilization, and he said he will use all the means at his disposal to protect Russia. The White House, though, has repeatedly said it takes Russia's threats of a nuclear war seriously, but does not see indications of a present threat. So Biden's most recent comments seem to be in line with that of the White House.
Thank you very much, Arirang, for today's coverage. Have a safe day. It's going to be chilly, so bundle up. I'll see you tomorrow.
You too, stay warm. See you tomorrow.
If you're listening to our program using the podcast service, just a reminder that we do go live Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time. So tune in and help us make the show more informative by giving us your input. See you bright and early on Good Morning Seoul.